October 25, 1944. Off Samar Island, Philippines. 7:43 hours. The morning air hung thick and heavy over the Philippine Sea, dense with humidity that clung to skin like wet gauze. Aboard the escort carrier USS St. Lo, radar operator Seaman First Class Robert Copley sat hunched over his console in the darkened Combat Information Center, eyes fixed on the green glow of the cathode ray tube before him. The screen swept continuously, a phosphorescent arm rotating through 360 degrees, painting targets as bright blips against the dark field. He had been at his station since 0600, tracking friendly aircraft returning from strikes against Japanese positions, monitoring the vast emptiness of sky surrounding the fleet. At 7:43, a new contact appeared. Range, 42 miles, bearing 315 degrees, altitude 8,000 feet. Single aircraft, inbound. Copley marked it, called it out to the Air Defense Coordinator. Nothing unusual, reconnaissance, perhaps, or a straggler from the morning combat air patrol. But the contact continued inbound, descending gradually, speed constant at 220 knots. At 30 miles, it was joined by 2 more contacts, then 3 more, all converging from different quadrants. Copley's hand moved to the intercom switch. His voice was steady, trained to remain calm, but his pulse had begun to accelerate. Multiple bogies inbound, all sectors. Estimate 20-plus contacts, ranges from 35 to 20 miles. Descending through 6,000 feet. Vectors indicate targeting this formation. The blips moved across his screen with deliberate purpose, not evading, not maneuvering, simply coming straight in. The radar saw them when they were invisible dots on the horizon, when human eyes could detect nothing but empty sky, when the distance was still sufficient for defensive measures. The technology gave warning, gave time, gave the fleet precious minutes to prepare. But technology could not alter what was coming, could not change the calculus of men who had decided that their aircraft would become weapons and their bodies would become warheads. At 20 miles, the first blips began descending more rapidly. At 15 miles, the fleet's guns opened fire, 5-inch mounts traversing to computed intercepts, 40mm Bofors crews tracking targets that were now visible as dark specks against the morning sky. At 10 miles, the radar screen became cluttered with contacts as more aircraft appeared, as if materializing from nothing. Copley watched the geometric ballet of defense unfold on his screen, the blips representing kamikaze aircraft intersecting with the arcs of anti-aircraft fire, some disappearing as shells found their marks, others continuing inbound with terrible inevitability. At 7:47, 4 minutes after first detection, one contact reached zero range. The ship shuddered with the impact. Copley felt it through the deck plates, through his chair, through his bones. The radar continued sweeping, indifferent to the explosion that had torn through the flight deck above, continuing to track the remaining contacts still inbound. The screen showed what human senses could not: the totality of the assault, the coordination of the attack, the mathematics of death approaching at 220 knots. He keyed the intercom again, reporting what the radar revealed: more contacts inbound, ranges from 12 to 30 miles, all converging. The warning went out across the fleet. Ships maneuvered, guns elevated, fighters were scrambled from carriers still able to launch. The battle would last another hour, would claim multiple ships, would demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of Japan's newest tactic, the deliberate sacrifice of pilot and aircraft in suicide attacks. But it would also demonstrate something else, something the Japanese High Command had not anticipated: that American technology could detect these attacks long before they struck, could coordinate defenses across entire task groups, could track multiple targets simultaneously and direct fire with precision impossible through visual observation alone. The radar saw everything, and in that seeing lay advantages that would transform the nature of this new, terrible form of warfare. The kamikaze, divine wind, emerged from desperation and ideology in equal measure. By autumn 1944, Japan's strategic situation in the Pacific had deteriorated beyond recovery. The combined fleet had been shattered in the battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. Carrier aviation, once the pride of the Imperial Navy, had been reduced to remnants, its veteran pilots dead or dispersed, its aircraft insufficient to contest American air superiority. Conventional attacks by Japanese aircraft against American naval forces were achieving negligible results while suffering catastrophic losses, loss rates exceeding 90% in some engagements, with minimal damage inflicted on American ships. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, commander of the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, proposed a solution that was tactically logical and spiritually horrifying: organized suicide attacks. If conventional bombing and torpedo runs could not penetrate American defenses, then Japanese pilots would guide their aircraft directly into American ships, transforming themselves into precision-guided weapons. The tactic eliminated the need for highly trained pilots. Relatively inexperienced flyers could be trained to take off, navigate to target areas, and dive into ships. It maximized damage potential. An aircraft crashing into a ship carried not only its bombs but its fuel, its engine, its entire mass as destructive force. And it appealed to the cultural mythology of sacrifice, of death before dishonor, of the warrior who chooses his own end rather than accepting defeat. The first organized kamikaze attacks were launched on October 25, 1944, against American escort carriers off Samar, the same engagement where Robert Copley watched radar contacts converge on his screen. 5 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, each carrying a 250-kilogram bomb, dove into the American formation. 4 struck ships. The USS St. Lo was sunk, becoming the first American aircraft carrier destroyed by kamikaze attack. The USS Santee, Sewanee, and White Plains were all damaged. The tactical success seemed to validate Onishi's theory. Suicide attacks achieved results that conventional attacks could not. Japanese commanders, analyzing the results, concluded they had found a weapon that could alter the strategic balance. If enough kamikaze attacks could be launched, if sufficient American ships could be sunk or damaged, perhaps the invasion of the Philippines could be disrupted, the American advance halted, terms negotiated that would preserve something of Japan's empire. The mathematics seemed favorable. Japan still possessed thousands of aircraft and tens of thousands of pilots, many with minimal training but sufficient skill to fly to a target and dive. If each pilot could sink or damage one ship, the cumulative effect would be devastating. But the mathematics rested on assumptions that proved fatally flawed. Japanese planners assumed that kamikaze aircraft could approach American fleets with the same relative ease as conventional attackers, that early warning would be minimal, that pilots would reach their targets before American defenses could react effectively. They assumed that American ships, optimized for offensive operations, would be vulnerable to this new tactic. They assumed that the psychological impact of suicide attacks would demoralize American sailors and erode American will to continue the campaign. They had not accounted for radar. They had not understood how thoroughly this technology would transform the equation of aerial assault, how completely it would negate the advantage of surprise, how decisively it would shift the balance in favor of defense. The divine wind would blow, but it would blow into a storm of coordinated fire guided by electronic eyes that saw everything, everywhere, continuously. Radar, radio detection and ranging, was not an American invention, but American implementation of the technology achieved scales and sophistication unmatched by any other combatant. The British developed the first operational radar systems in the late 1930s, using them to critical effect during the Battle of Britain. The Germans, Japanese, and Soviets all fielded radar systems during the war. But American industrial capacity and research infrastructure transformed radar from a useful tool into a comprehensive system that permeated every aspect of naval operations. By 1944, American warships carried multiple radar systems serving distinct functions. Search radars scanned for aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles, providing early warning of incoming raids. Fire control radars tracked individual targets, computing firing solutions for anti-aircraft guns with precision impossible through optical sights alone. Surface search radars detected ships and obstacles. Navigation radars allowed operations in darkness and poor weather. The technology had evolved from crude systems that could barely distinguish targets from sea clutter to sophisticated arrays capable of tracking dozens of contacts simultaneously. The SC-2 search radar, installed on most American carriers and larger escorts by 1944, could detect aircraft at ranges up to 120 miles depending on altitude and atmospheric conditions. The system rotated continuously, sweeping the entire horizon every few seconds, displaying contacts on cathode ray tubes in darkened combat information centers. Trained operators learned to distinguish aircraft from weather, single contacts from formations, friendly from hostile based on behavior patterns and coordination with fighter direction officers. The integration of radar into fleet air defense represented organizational innovation as significant as the technology itself. Combat information centers became the nerve centers of American warships, where radar data, radio communications, and visual observations converged into comprehensive tactical pictures. Air defense coordinators could see threats before lookouts spotted them, could vector fighters to intercepts before enemy aircraft came within gun range, could coordinate defensive fire across entire formations. The technology enabled centralized command and decentralized execution, tactical doctrine that multiplied the effectiveness of individual weapon systems. For Japanese kamikaze pilots, this meant that their approach was detected long before they reached their targets. The advantage of surprise, critical to the success of conventional attacks, was eliminated. American combat air patrols could be vectored to intercept inbound raids while they were still dozens of miles from the fleet. Anti-aircraft guns could be trained to computed intercept points before targets were visually acquired. Ships could maneuver to optimize defensive positions, could coordinate their fire, could prepare damage control parties before impact. The psychological dimensions were equally important. American sailors, informed by radar of inbound attacks, had time to prepare mentally and physically. They manned battle stations with knowledge of what was coming rather than being caught by surprise. Damage control teams positioned themselves strategically. Medical personnel prepared for casualties. The warning reduced panic, enabled coordinated response, transformed kamikaze attacks from bolt-from-the-blue surprises into anticipated threats that could be systematically countered. Japanese commanders, initially unaware of how thoroughly radar had transformed American defensive capabilities, continued to plan kamikaze operations using assumptions derived from earlier combat experience. They estimated that attacks launched from bases 100 to 200 miles from American fleets would achieve tactical surprise, that pilots could approach at low altitude to avoid detection, that the massed nature of kamikaze strikes would overwhelm point defenses. Intelligence reports describing American radar capabilities were often dismissed as exaggerations or regarded as irrelevant. How much difference could early warning make against pilots determined to die? The answer was, all the difference. The kamikaze campaign intensified through late 1944 and into 1945 as American forces advanced toward the Japanese home islands. The invasion of Luzon in January 1945 saw hundreds of kamikaze sorties launched against the invasion fleet. The Iwo Jima operation in February faced similar attacks. But it was during the Okinawa campaign, from April to June 1945, that the kamikaze offensive reached its crescendo, and where the effectiveness of American radar-directed defense was most clearly demonstrated. The Battle of Okinawa involved 10 massive kamikaze operations, designated Kikusui, floating chrysanthemum, each involving hundreds of aircraft. Between April 6 and June 22, Japanese forces launched approximately 1,900 kamikaze sorties against American naval forces supporting the invasion. The attacks sank 36 American ships, damaged 368 others, and inflicted over 9,000 casualties. The material and human cost was significant, the highest American naval losses in any single campaign of the Pacific War. But the losses must be understood in context. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining air force to these attacks, nearly 2,000 aircraft and pilots expended in 10 weeks of operations. The exchange ratio was catastrophic from Japan's perspective, approximately 50 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American ship sunk. Most kamikaze aircraft never reached their targets, shot down by combat air patrols or anti-aircraft fire guided by radar. Those that did penetrate the defenses usually struck smaller vessels, destroyers on radar picket duty, landing craft, support ships, rather than the high-value carriers and battleships that were primary targets. The radar picket destroyers exemplified the system that frustrated Japanese kamikaze operations. These ships, positioned 50 to 80 miles from the main fleet along likely approach vectors, served as early warning stations. Their radars could detect inbound raids at maximum range, providing the fleet with 30 to 40 minutes warning, time sufficient to launch additional fighters, to position ships optimally, to prepare all defenses. The picket destroyers paid a terrible price for this role. Several were sunk, many more damaged, but they disrupted the timing and coordination of kamikaze attacks, forcing Japanese aircraft to engage defenders long before reaching primary targets. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, whose destroyer USS Daly served on radar picket duty off Okinawa, described the system in his action report filed May 1945. Radar detection at ranges of 30 to 50 miles provided sufficient warning to vector CAP to intercepts and to bring all guns to bear on computed approach vectors. In 17 separate engagements, radar warning averaged 38 minutes prior to visual contact. This warning enabled defensive measures that destroyed approximately 75% of attackers before they closed to effective attack range. The remaining 25% faced concentrated anti-aircraft fire guided by fire control radar. Our success rate would be impossible without radar early warning and fire control. The statistics support Moosbrugger's assessment. Analysis of kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign shows that approximately 20% of attacking aircraft were destroyed by combat air patrols vectored to intercepts using radar data. Another 50% were destroyed by anti-aircraft fire before reaching their targets. Only about 30% of kamikaze aircraft successfully struck ships, and many of these hits occurred on picket ships rather than primary targets. The survival rate for kamikaze pilots, essentially zero by definition, meant that each attack consumed trained pilots and aircraft that Japan could not replace. Japanese commanders, receiving reports from the few surviving escort aircraft and analyzing reconnaissance data, gradually came to understand the role radar was playing in their mounting losses. The technological gap was both tactical and systemic. Tactically, radar provided American forces with early warning and fire control capabilities that Japanese forces lacked. Systemically, radar represented an integration of technology, doctrine, and organization that Japan could not replicate even if it possessed the hardware. Vice Admiral Mato Mogaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet responsible for kamikaze operations during Okinawa, recorded his growing frustration in his diary, a document that survived the war and was later translated and published. His entry from April 16, 1945, reflects the dawning realization: our attacks are detected at great distances. The enemy vectors fighters to intercept our formations before they approach the fleet. Their anti-aircraft fire begins while our aircraft are still beyond visual range, guided by some means we cannot counter. Our pilots report being engaged by enemy fighters 50 to 60 kilometers from target, distances at which we believed we would achieve surprise. The enemy's detection capabilities exceed our intelligence estimates. We are fighting blind against an enemy who sees everything. The phrase, fighting blind, recurs in Japanese operational documents from this period. Despite having radar technology themselves, Japanese destroyers and larger warships were equipped with air search and surface search radars. The Japanese implementation was years behind American capabilities. Japanese radar systems generally had shorter range, lower resolution, and less reliability than American equivalents. More critically, Japan had not developed the organizational structures to integrate radar data into comprehensive defensive systems. Radar operators worked in isolation, reporting contacts to bridge officers who made tactical decisions without the benefit of centralized coordination. There were no Japanese equivalents to American combat information centers, no systematic doctrine for using radar to coordinate fleet air defense. The technological and organizational gap reflected deeper differences in how the two nations approached innovation and warfare. American forces emphasized system integration, developing not just individual technologies but comprehensive networks that multiplied effectiveness. Radar was integrated with communications, with fighter direction, with gun fire control, with damage assessment. The integration was imperfect, often improvised, constantly evolving, but it created capabilities that exceeded the sum of individual components. Japanese forces, by contrast, tended to treat technologies as discrete tools rather than integrated systems. Radar was regarded as an improved form of observation, useful for detection but not fundamentally transforming tactical doctrine. The cultural emphasis on individual warrior spirit over technological solutions meant that radar was undervalued compared to pilot skill and tactical finesse. When kamikaze tactics were adopted, the focus remained on pilot training and aircraft performance rather than on how to counter American technological advantages that made those factors increasingly irrelevant. The result was a campaign of attrition that Japan could not afford. Each Kikusui operation expended hundreds of aircraft and pilots for marginal strategic effect. American ships were sunk and damaged, American casualties mounted, but the invasion of Okinawa proceeded on schedule. American industrial capacity replaced damaged ships within months. American training programs produced replacement pilots faster than combat consumed them. The American fleet actually grew larger over the course of the Okinawa campaign as reinforcements arrived from rear areas. Japan had no equivalent capacity for regeneration. Aircraft lost in kamikaze attacks were drawn from training schools, from homeland defense units, from the final reserves accumulated for the anticipated invasion of Japan itself. Pilots killed in kamikaze missions represented the last generation of Japanese naval aviators, young men with minimal training, flying obsolescent aircraft, sent on one-way missions because conventional tactics had proven completely ineffective against American defenses. The human cost of the kamikaze campaign was documented in letters and diaries, many of which were recovered after the war and have since been translated and published. These documents reveal men grappling with the contradiction between traditional warrior values and the reality of suicide tactics, between the promise of glory and the actual experience of flying towards certain death against an enemy whose technological superiority made success unlikely. Ensign Ichizo Hayashi, a 22-year-old pilot who flew with the 201st Naval Air Group, wrote to his parents 3 days before his final mission in May 1945, "We are told that our sacrifice will save Japan, that each of us will sink an enemy ship and turn the tide of battle. But we also hear reports from those who have observed the attacks. The enemy detects our formations when we are still far from target. Their fighters intercept us before we reach the fleet. Their anti-aircraft fire is accurate beyond anything we have faced. Most of our comrades do not reach their targets. They die without achieving their purpose, without even seeing the ships they intended to strike. I will do my duty, but I harbor no illusions about the outcome. We are not divine wind. We are desperate men sent against an enemy whose advantages we cannot overcome." Hayashi's aircraft was shot down by F-6F Hellcat fighters from USS Bennington on May 11, 1945, 43 miles from the American fleet. His death was recorded by American radar operators as one of 7 contacts eliminated by combat air patrol before reaching gun range. The clinical precision of radar data, time, range, altitude, vector, captured none of the human dimension of a young man's death but recorded with absolute fidelity the tactical effectiveness of the system that killed him. The psychological burden on Japanese commanders who organized these missions was documented in post-war interviews and memoirs. They understood, often better than their pilots, the futility of sending men on missions from which return was impossible and success was improbable. But they also faced strategic realities that offered no alternatives. Conventional attacks were completely ineffective. Defensive operations could only delay defeat. The kamikaze, despite its horrific costs and diminishing returns, represented the only tactic that inflicted significant casualties on American forces. Admiral Ogaki, in one of his final diary entries before his own death in a kamikaze attack on August 15, 1945, reflected on the campaign, "We sent them knowing most would fail, knowing the enemy's defenses would destroy them before they reached their targets. But what choice did we have? To do nothing was to accept defeat without resistance. To continue conventional attacks was to waste pilots and aircraft for no effect. The kamikaze at least damaged enemy ships, at least imposed costs, at least demonstrated that Japan would fight to the end. But I do not deceive myself about what we accomplished. We did not alter the strategic situation. We did not halt the American advance. We sacrificed thousands of young men and achieved only delay. Their radar saw us coming. Their fighters met us far from target. Their guns tracked us with precision we could not counter. We were fighting with swords against an enemy armed with rifles. Courage was insufficient. The symbolic weight of radar in this campaign extended beyond its tactical function. For Japanese forces, radar represented the technological gap that underlay their strategic predicament. They could see American radar antennas on ships, distinctive rotating arrays mounted high on superstructures, but they could not replicate the integrated systems those antennas supported. They could intercept American radio communications directing fighters to intercepts but could not jam or disrupt the system effectively. They could observe the results. Their aircraft shot down at distances that should have been safe, their attacks disrupted before reaching targets, but they could not counter the technology that produced those results. Radar became a symbol of American material and technological superiority, a visible manifestation of the industrial and scientific advantages that Japan could not overcome. It represented a form of warfare that privileged engineering over warrior spirit, that made technology more decisive than individual courage, that systematized killing in ways that removed the personal element Japanese military culture had long emphasized. The kamikaze pilot, embodying supreme individual sacrifice, faced a defensive system that was impersonal, automated, relentlessly efficient, a system that tracked him as a blip on a screen, computed firing solutions algorithmically, destroyed him without malice or honor, merely as a mathematical outcome of properly functioning machinery. For American forces, radar represented confidence and control. Sailors who might have felt helpless against suicide attacks, how could one defend against an enemy determined to die? found reassurance in the technology that gave warning and enabled response. Radar operators like Robert Copley, watching contacts appear on their screens, felt a sense of agency, of participating in the ship's defense even while sitting in darkened spaces far from the guns and aircraft that actually destroyed targets. The technology made the invisible visible, made the distant immediate, made the chaos of aerial combat comprehensible through geometric abstraction. The rotating sweep of the radar antenna, visible on the masts and superstructures of American ships, became an icon of American naval power in the Pacific. Photographs and newsreels from the period often featured these antennas prominently, their distinctive shapes immediately recognizable to sailors and civilians alike. The green glow of radar screens appeared in training films, in combat documentaries, in the cultural imagination as the signature image of American technological warfare. The technology was classified, its capabilities were secrets closely guarded, but its existence was public, a source of national pride and psychological reassurance. The contrast with Japanese capabilities was stark. Japanese ships carried radar, but the technology was regarded as supplementary rather than central. Japanese combat doctrine continued to emphasize visual observation, optical rangefinding, decentralized decision-making by individual ship commanders. When Japanese forces attempted to organize air defenses against American carrier raids, they lacked the centralized coordination that radar enabled. Individual ships fired when targets came within range, but there was no fleet-wide integration, no systematic vectoring of fighters, no layered defense coordinated across dozens of ships. The result was that American carrier aircraft faced less effective resistance than kamikaze aircraft faced from American defenses, despite both sides possessing similar numbers of anti-aircraft weapons. The effectiveness of radar-directed defense was quantified in operational research conducted during and after the Okinawa campaign. Analysts from the Operations Research Group, U.S. Navy, examined thousands of action reports, radar plots, and after-action interviews to assess the factors that determined kamikaze success rates. Their classified report, declassified in 1975, provided statistical validation for what radar operators and commanders had observed. Early warning was the decisive variable. Kamikaze attacks detected at ranges greater than 40 miles had success rates, defined as aircraft reaching targets and inflicting damage, below 15%. Attacks detected between 20 and 40 miles had success rates around 25%. Attacks that achieved tactical surprise, approaching without radar detection until within 10 miles, had success rates exceeding 50%. The correlation was absolute. The earlier the detection, the lower the success rate. The report's conclusions were unequivocal. Radar early warning is the most critical single factor in kamikaze defense. All other defensive measures, combat air patrol, anti-aircraft fire, ship maneuvers, depend on time to prepare and execute. Radar provides that time. Without radar, kamikaze attacks would inflict casualties at rates 3 to 4 times higher than currently observed. The technology does not directly destroy attacking aircraft, but it enables all other defensive systems to function effectively. It transforms suicide attacks from near impossible to defend against surprises into tactically manageable threats. Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing the same data from their perspective, reached complementary conclusions. A report from the Naval General Staff dated June 1945, captured after the war and translated by American intelligence, assessed the kamikaze campaign. Enemy radar detection capabilities exceed all previous estimates. Our attacks are identified at distances of 60 to 100 kilometers. Enemy fighters are directed to intercepts with precision that suggests detailed information about our formation's composition, altitude, and heading. Enemy anti-aircraft fire commences at ranges beyond visual acquisition, indicating radar-directed gun laying. These capabilities reduce our success rate to levels that make continued operations of questionable value. We are expending irreplaceable pilots and aircraft at rates that cannot be sustained for anticipated effects. Unless we can counter or evade enemy radar, kamikaze tactics cannot achieve strategic objectives. The report's recommendations: develop radar jamming, adopt low-altitude approaches to evade radar detection, coordinate attacks to overwhelm defenses, came too late and with insufficient resources to implement. Japan lacked the electronics industry to produce effective jamming equipment. Low-altitude approaches reduced detection range but also limited the kamikaze pilot's ability to navigate and identify targets. Coordinating large-scale simultaneous attacks required communications infrastructure and operational security that Japanese forces could no longer maintain. The strategic situation had progressed beyond the point where tactical adjustments could alter outcomes. By summer 1945, Japan faced invasion of the home islands by American forces whose technological advantages included not only radar but proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, jet aircraft entering service, and atomic weapons in final preparation. The Kamikaze campaign, which had seemed to offer hope of inflicting sufficient casualties to force negotiated peace, had instead demonstrated that even supreme individual sacrifice could not overcome systemic material and technological inferiority. The final kamikaze attacks of the war occurred on August 15, 1945, the day Japan announced its surrender. Admiral Ogaki, who had commanded kamikaze operations throughout the campaign, chose to die in a final unauthorized attack, taking off from Oita Air Base with 10 other aircraft to strike American ships off Okinawa. The formation was detected by radar at 1,634 hours, range 67 miles. Combat Air Patrol was vectored to intercept. Ogaki's aircraft and most of his formation were shot down over the ocean, more than 30 miles from the nearest American ship. His death, like thousands of others in the kamikaze campaign, was recorded as a radar contact that appeared, was tracked, was engaged, and disappeared from the screen. The post-war analysis of the kamikaze campaign concluded that the tactic, while terrifying and destructive, had failed strategically. It had not prevented American forces from capturing the Philippines, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. It had not sunk enough ships to significantly delay operations. It had not broken American morale or will to continue the war. It had cost Japan its remaining air force, had expended pilots who would be desperately needed to defend the home islands, had demonstrated to American planners that Japanese resistance would be fanatical but could be overcome through application of superior material and technology. The role of radar in defeating the kamikaze offensive was recognized in post-war assessments. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, wrote in his summary of the Okinawa campaign, "The enemy's suicide tactics presented a new and dangerous threat. The solution was found not in new weapons but in maximum exploitation of existing capabilities, particularly radar. Early detection enabled coordinated defense that destroyed the majority of attackers before they threatened the fleet. Radar did not make us invulnerable, we suffered significant losses, but it made the enemy's tactics survivable, and in a war of attrition, survivability determines outcomes." For the radar operators who had manned their screens through months of combat, watching contacts appear and disappear, tracking the geometric ballet of attack and defense, the vindication was personal and professional. They had performed a crucial role that was largely invisible. No medals for radar contacts detected, no glory for intercepts vectored successfully, no recognition for the attacks that never materialized because early warning enabled prevention. But they knew, as did their commanders, that the green glow of their screens had been as important as any gun or fighter in defending the fleet. Robert Copley, the radar operator who had watched the first kamikaze attacks off Samar in October 1944, remained at sea through the end of the war, serving on USS St. Lo's sister ship after St. Lo was sunk. In an oral history interview conducted in 1988, he reflected on his experience. "We saw them coming, always. Sometimes from 60, 70 miles away. We watched them approach, watched fighters intercept them, watched them disappear from the screen. Each blip represented a pilot, a human being who had chosen to die. The radar didn't care. It just swept and tracked and displayed. But for us, watching those screens, knowing what those contacts meant, it was intimate in a strange way. We couldn't see them, couldn't hear them, couldn't know anything about them except their position, altitude, and speed. But we knew their intention, and we knew our warning would lead to their death or ours. The technology created distance, they were just blips, but also immediacy. Every contact mattered. Every one we detected early was one our defenses could engage. We didn't win the war on radar screens, but we gave our ships the time they needed to fight back. That was our job, and we did it every day until there were no more contacts to track." The legacy of radar in the Pacific War extended far beyond the kamikaze campaign. The technology that enabled defense against suicide attacks also revolutionized naval warfare more broadly, transformed air combat, enabled amphibious operations, and established patterns of military technology development that persist to the present. Radar represented a paradigm shift from warfare based on visual range and human observation to warfare based on electronic sensing and systematic information processing. But in the specific context of the kamikaze offensive, radar's importance was uniquely decisive. Japan had developed a tactic that maximized pilot determination, that eliminated the need for advanced training, that guaranteed hits if aircraft reached their targets. The tactic should have been devastatingly effective against an enemy whose ships, loaded with aviation fuel and ammunition, were vulnerable to catastrophic damage from single hits. The mathematics seemed to favor the attacker: one pilot, one plane, one ship damaged or sunk. Radar broke that equation. It ensured that most attackers never reached their targets, that the theoretical exchange ratio was never achieved in practice, that the strategic premise, inflict unsustainable casualties to force negotiated peace, was invalid from the start. The technology didn't make American ships invulnerable, but it made them defensible, and in the arithmetic of attrition warfare between opponents with vastly different industrial capacities, defensible was sufficient for victory. Japanese commanders who survived the war and reflected on their defeat consistently cited technological disparities as decisive factors. In his post-war memoir, Admiral Somu Toyoda, chief of the Naval General Staff during the final year of the war, wrote, "We understood that America's industrial production exceeded ours, that they could build more ships and aircraft than we could destroy. But we believed that spirit and sacrifice could compensate, that our willingness to die would overcome their material advantages." The kamikaze was the ultimate expression of this belief. But we had not accounted for their technology. Their radar saw everything. Their systems coordinated defenses we could not penetrate in sufficient numbers. Our pilots died with great courage, but courage alone could not overcome the technological gap. This was the lesson we learned too late, that modern warfare is decided by systems, by technology integrated into comprehensive defense, by industrial capacity applied to electronic advantage. Individual sacrifice, no matter how great, cannot overcome systematic technological superiority. The acknowledgement was bitter but accurate. Japan had committed its remaining air force to a campaign based on cultural values, sacrifice, honor, warrior spirit, but fought against an enemy whose advantages were systemic and technological. The kamikaze pilots were brave, their sacrifice was real, their determination was absolute. But they were visible on radar screens from the moment they took off, were tracked throughout their approach, were engaged by defenses that had time to prepare because technology provided warning that courage could not overcome. Standing today in the Combat Information Center of USS Missouri, now a museum ship in Pearl Harbor, one can see preserved radar equipment from the war, the repeater screens, the plotting tables, the communication systems that coordinated defense. The equipment is primitive by contemporary standards, vacuum tubes and mechanical computers that would be obsolete within a decade. But in 1944-1945, this technology represented the cutting edge of military capability, represented advantages that determined tactical outcomes and shaped strategic realities. The radar antennas that once rotated above the ship are still there, mounted on the mast, their shapes instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with the period. They don't rotate anymore, frozen in position, but they remain as monuments to the technology that helped win the Pacific War. Tourist guides explain their function: detecting aircraft at long range, providing early warning, enabling coordinated defense. The explanations are accurate but necessarily simplified. They cannot fully convey what those antennas meant to the sailors who depended on them, what their presence represented to enemies who faced them, how thoroughly the technology they embodied transformed the nature of naval warfare. In Japanese naval museums, there are displays about the kamikaze campaign, photos of pilots, models of aircraft, translated letters from men who flew the missions. The exhibits honor the courage and sacrifice, present the human stories of young men who died for their country. But they also, increasingly, acknowledge the tactical and strategic failures, the mismatch between cultural values and material realities, the inability of individual sacrifice to overcome technological disadvantage. Some exhibits include information about American radar, explaining how the technology contributed to Japanese losses, contextualizing the defeat within the larger framework of industrial and technological disparities. The historical record is clear. Radar was not the only factor in defeating the kamikaze offensive, but it was essential. Without early warning, American losses would have been catastrophically higher. With early warning, the attacks were survivable, the campaign was sustainable, the strategic outcome was never in doubt. Technology provided time to vector fighters, time to train guns, time to maneuver, time to prepare. And in the compressed time frame of aerial attack, where decisions were measured in seconds and distances in miles, time was everything. The kamikaze pilots flew toward their targets with determination that history recognizes and honors. They were detected by radar operators watching screens in darkened compartments, men whose vigilance gave their ships the warning that enabled survival. Both groups did their duty as they understood it, served their countries as they were asked to serve, participated in a campaign that demonstrated a fundamental truth about modern warfare: that technology can overcome courage, that systems can defeat sacrifice, that wars are decided not only by warriors but by the tools warriors wield and the advantages those tools provide. The rotating radar antenna, that symbolic object, mundane yet profound, embodied American technological superiority in the Pacific War. It was not a weapon that destroyed directly, but a sensor that enabled destruction. It did not kill enemies, but it saw them coming from distances that rendered surprise impossible and defense effective. It represented the integration of science, industry, and military doctrine that characterized American warfare, the systematic application of technological advantage that ultimately proved more decisive than any individual act of courage or sacrifice. The divine wind blew across the Pacific in 1944 and 1945, carrying young men to their deaths in aircraft that became weapons. But the wind was detected before it arrived, was tracked as it approached, was met with coordinated defense that it could not overcome. The radar saw everything, every approach, every attack, every sacrifice made in the hope of changing an outcome that technology and industry had already determined. And in that seeing, in that systematic observation and coordinated response, lay the difference between tactical effectiveness and strategic failure, between honorable sacrifice and futile gesture, between a threat that might have altered history and an offensive that, despite its terrible costs in lives on both sides, ultimately confirmed what was already becoming clear: that Japan could not win a war against an enemy whose technological advantages, whose industrial capacity, whose systematic integration of science and warfare, had progressed beyond the point where courage alone could bridge the gap. The screens are dark now, the contacts long since faded, the operators who watched them mostly gone. But the legacy remains, in the ships that survived because of early warning, in the pilots who returned because fighters were vectored in time, in the strategic outcome that was shaped by technology that saw what human eyes could not and provided the time that made defense possible. The radar swept continuously, painting the sky with electrons, revealing what was hidden, transforming warfare from art to science, from valor to vectors, from courage confronting courage to systems overwhelming sacrifice. And in that transformation, profound and irreversible, the Pacific War was decided not only by battles fought but by technologies applied, not only by warriors dying but by engineers innovating, not only by sacrifice offered but by advantages exploited. The divine wind blew, but the radar saw it coming. And in that simple, terrible fact lay the explanation for an outcome that courage could not alter and sacrifice could not prevent.